One of the images of this week that I'll remember for some time is Sir Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, with a sledgehammer, smashing down a blue wall following his party's dramatic by-election win in Chesham and Amersham. And I just want to sort of, we've talked about the Red Wall endlessly for the last couple of years. And this is the first time we've really started to talk about the blue wall. And of course, we know that in places like Chesham and Amersham, very wealthy constituencies, it was 55-45 Remain. So in these wealthier parts of the Tory heartlands, Brexit's not quite as popular as it was, but equally in terms of big government and many other areas, there are some traditional Shire Tories not recognising this much as a Tory government. Tom Harwood joins me. Tom, is this just one of those classic sort of Orpington moments or whatever it may be when the Lib Dems storm a constituency? They might hold it for one general election, but generally they don't. Or is something bigger going on here in the home counties in the south of England?
Well, there's certainly a lot of spooked Tory MPs as a result of this by-election. There's lots of people in sort of Lib Dem-facing seats. And remember, the Lib Dems came second in a lot of places in 2019, particularly with their Remain strategy just didn't work in terms of winning seats. But in terms of embedding themselves in second places, that was, to some extent, a bit of a success. So being able to sort of capitalise upon that is certainly spooking some Tory MPs. But I think there is a danger of over-interpreting this. I mean, we're 11 years in to having a Tory Prime Minister. It's normal for upsets like this to occur. It's actually quite unusual that the government wins by-elections, and the government has won a by-election up in Hartlepool just a few weeks ago. So yes, there is obviously that narrative developing, but to what extent is it a general narrative or the particular issues of that constituency? HS2, a huge one, and house building, another one. A lot of those voters self-proclaimed NIMBYs, not in my backyard, for housing. And the Lib Dems ran this very, very targeted campaign on those two issues. There were leaflets that the Lib Dems were able to put out with Theresa May's face on them, opposing the new Tory house building plans. And that really spooked a lot of those voters in that election. I think the other thing to note is that the turnout was a lot lower than the general election. Yeah. So there were lots of Tories who stayed home. 52%, wasn't it? Yeah, around in that region, and those people might turn out in a general election, so that might flip the result ultimately. So the Tory party, Dehenna, Davison, has focused solely on the Red Wall and on Bishop Auckland and people like you, and it's neglected its traditional base that's been there for a very long time. Is the Blue Wall in trouble, in your opinion?
Well, I certainly don't think so. As I said earlier on the show, and as Tom's just highlighted there, we are 11 years into government, and ordinarily it would be the norm for a government of 11 years to lose a by-election as the governing party. Obviously, I'm not happy that we lost the seat, and particularly, Dame Cheryl Gillan, the previous MP, was a wonderful woman, a fantastic MP, and a great friend to so many. So it's kind of sad not to see her legacy be able to be continued by the Conservative candidate Peter Fleet. But I'm sorry, I've lost sound, Nigel, so I'm going to carry on, but someone can nudge me if they need to. But certainly, I don't think that there has to necessarily be an either or. I don't think we have to abandon our heartlands, because again, it comes down to Conservative values and it comes down to principles. And that's about making sure that opportunity is spread right across the country. It's something that unites every single Conservative, and we don't need to kind of harm one bunch of people at the expense of the other.
So, Tom, there's about 100 Tory MPs in this WhatsApp. They love WhatsApp groups, don't they, the Tories, it would seem. And then they imagine they're talking to each other in private, and they're stunned when it all leaks out all over the place, as it's bound to. But, I mean, is it planning? Is it house building? Is this the biggest worry those backbenchers have, in your opinion, Tom? Well,
there's certainly a big worry amongst Tory MPs, but there's two sides to this coin, as there are of every issue. If we look at the success in Hartlepool, the Tory vote came from homeowners. We know that people who own their own homes, who start their own families, are much more likely to vote Conservative. So opposing building houses is a terrible, terrible policy from the Conservative perspective. effective in the long term, even though in the short term, obviously, that hurts homeowners if house prices don't continue to rise and rise. So there's sort of two competing interests here: what's right for the Tory party in the long term and what's right in the absolute short term. But it's interesting, the government is still sticking by this proposal, which has already been watered down to an extent. These rebels led by Theresa May, who's become a bit of a serial rebel now on the backbenches of the Tory party in Parliament, they got rid of this sort of algorithm that would have put more houses where they were most needed. And now the planning reforms are actually a bit weaker than they were before, but still dividing areas into places for development and places for conservation. That still does worry some people. So it will be interesting to see how strongly the government sticks by these reforms, because they are ultimately necessary if the Tory party wants to keep winning in the future. Interestingly, this morning, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey, started saying that he was a YIMBY. Yes, in my backyard. He wants to see more houses being built, which is totally contrary to how he ran that by-election. It's been 3 days and they've just turned on a dime.
And this, Tom, is why this is why they can't do it in a general election, because they can't get away. Well, number one, they can't pack a constituency with hundreds of activists. But number two, they'd be torn apart in the national press for contradictory messages like this. And yet they seem to get away with it in by-election after by-election. Talking of WhatsApp groups and texts, Dominic Cummings, it would appear, is never ever going to go away. He must have stored up a complete treasure trove of messages in his time at Number 10, and perhaps even before at Vote Leave, who's to say. He was particularly unpleasant about Matt Hancock. Does this really matter to Matt Hancock, or is in your opinion, Tom, is in your opinion anything that Dominic Cummings now says just devalued?
I think that there's a very significant reason as to why Keir Starmer didn't run on this in Prime Minister's Questions. Remember, all of these messages were released in a Substack blog from Dominic Cummings about half an hour before PMQs started, and yet, curiously, the Labour leader didn't run on any of it. Now, there's two theories as to why that was. Number one, Keir Starmer perhaps isn't that nimble on his feet. He needs to only read out things that he prepared hours or days in advance and sort of can't be quick on his feet in the Commons. But the other school of thought is that actually, what does the Labour Party, or indeed political opponents of this government, gain from bigging up someone who they've spent the last year saying is an unreliable witness? So really, when we talk about the big political implications of this, I think that we can overinterpret that. However, the reason Dominic Cummings is putting out this stuff isn't to try and get at the government politically, in my opinion. I think it's more that he's very, very keen to change the way that the government works. One of the huge things he wanted to do in Number 10 and never got the opportunity to is civil service reform, is changing how governments, the machinery of government operates. And by putting out a lot of the information in terms of how dysfunctional some of these departments are, how the leadership in them, in his opinion, is poor, and the accountability structure is even worse, by putting this all out on the table, it might not be a particularly interesting conversation for the wider country, but I think he's really trying to push reform internally.
Tom, I'm much more cynical than you. I think he's always been Michael Gove's man, not Boris Johnson's. That close relationship has always been with Michael Gove. And I think what Cummings wants is Boris out, Michael Gove in Number 10, and him back in charge running the country. That's what I think. Let's go to Dehenna. Dehenna, is Matt Hancock hopeless in your opinion? Because that is what the Prime Minister is alleged to have put in a series of tweets.
Oh, it's certainly not my thoughts on Matt. I think right throughout the pandemic, Matt has been an absolute Duracell bunny of energy, of commitment, of dedication. At any time, sort of night or day, if you contact him or one of his spads with a particular issue, you'll get a response with it within half an hour. And I think that sort of dedication to tackling this pandemic and getting us through this really difficult period as a country really is to be commended. Of course, there'll be a time at some point in the future when this is behind us to talk about the decisions that were made, whether we could have done things differently and who played what role in those decisions. But for now, I do think the Health Secretary has had so much responsibility put on his shoulders and has been getting so much unfounded criticism. And what Dominic Cummings' vendetta against him is, I really have no idea. But certainly if it was a choice between being on Team Cummings or Team Hancock, I know which side I'd be on, and it certainly wouldn't be with the man who frequented Barnard Castle.
No, your fellow Northeaster. So do we just discount anything that Cummings says from now on, Dehenna?
Well, I think it's the manner in which he is releasing this stuff. Certainly now that he's charging for access to his Substack blog as well, as if to say, oh, look, I've got shocking revelations, give me some money and you can read all about them. I think it's really bad form for someone who's been kind of at the heart of government at a really difficult time to be doing this, potentially damaging the government when, frankly, the government is still fighting to get us through the tail end of this pandemic.
Hang on, Dehenna. Sorry.
He's looking for his second 15.
We had such criticism of Dominic Cummings for not releasing the allegations he made, not releasing the evidence behind the allegations he made to the Joint Select Committee a couple of weeks ago, and there was huge criticism of him for not producing the receipts, producing the evidence. As soon as he publishes the evidence behind those claims, now everyone is criticising him for publishing that evidence. He can't win here.
It's Dominic Cummings once again being this anti-establishment contrarian. He should have produced the evidence to the Select Committee, done it through the official channels. Instead, he's trying to prove himself as this sort of anti-establishment figure, doing it through his Substack, doing it through his blog, which, once again, I believe he's charging for access to some parts of his Substack, so could be profiting off this sort of shock factor revelations. He should have produced the evidence to the Select Committee if he had it. Why he didn't, I'll never know, but certainly it just seems it's another way of being anti-establishment and trying to prove his sort of anti-establishment credentials when actually the country's got far bigger things to be getting on with at the moment.
Well, you may well be right, Dehenna, but I tell you one thing, Dominic Cummings will not be going away. Tom, thank you for joining us for this segment. Now, coming up, we have the Bishop of Manchester, and he's going to be with us to talk about common ground, the things that we share, and in particular, what his congregation's been telling him this week.